In the annals of aerial warfare, certain names carry the weight of tragedy and transformation in equal measure. Schweinfurt is one such name. To understand what transpired on that autumn day in 1943, we must first understand the machine at the center of the story and the philosophy that governed its use. The Boeing B-17, dubbed the Flying Fortress by journalists who marveled at its defensive armament, represented more than an engineering achievement. It embodied a particular American faith in technological supremacy and tactical doctrine that would be tested to its absolute limits. The aircraft itself was genuinely impressive by the standards of its era. 4 Wright Cyclone engines provided the power to carry crews of 10 men, along with several tons of high-explosive ordnance to targets deep within enemy territory. The defensive armament consisted of multiple .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns positioned throughout the aircraft, creating overlapping fields of fire that theoretically protected the bomber from attack in any direction. There were positions in the nose, the dorsal turret, the ball turret beneath the fuselage, the waist positions on either side, and the tail. Each gun was capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, and when multiple aircraft flew in tight formation, the combined firepower was supposed to create an impenetrable shield of steel. The American strategic bombing doctrine rested on several key assumptions. First, that precision attacks on critical industrial targets during daylight hours would be more effective than the area bombing campaigns conducted by the British Royal Air Force at night. Second, that heavily armed bombers flying in disciplined formations could defend themselves against fighter attacks without requiring fighter escort throughout the entire mission. Third, that systematic destruction of key industries, particularly ball-bearing manufacturing, would cripple the German war economy and hasten the end of the conflict. These assumptions were not baseless. They were grounded in careful analysis, tactical theory, and genuine belief in American industrial and technological capabilities. But belief, no matter how sincere, cannot alter the harsh realities of combat. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt represented what military planners call a choke point, a single critical component whose destruction would cascade throughout the enemy's entire industrial system. Ball bearings, those seemingly simple assemblies of precision-machined steel spheres, were essential to virtually every piece of military equipment. Tanks required them for their turret mechanisms and running gear. Aircraft engines depended on them. Naval vessels needed them for propeller shafts and gun turrets. Transport vehicles, factory machinery, even small arms production relied on bearings manufactured to exacting tolerances. Intelligence estimates suggested that the factories around Schweinfurt produced nearly half of Germany's total ball-bearing supply, and that a sustained campaign against these facilities could reduce German armaments production by 30 to 40% within months. This made Schweinfurt an irresistible target, despite its location deep within German territory, far beyond the range of existing fighter escorts. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's primary escort fighter in the summer and autumn of 1943, was a formidable aircraft in its own right. Heavily armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, ruggedly constructed, and capable of absorbing significant battle damage, the Thunderbolt earned the respect of its pilots and the fear of German fighter pilots who encountered it. However, its internal fuel capacity limited its effective combat radius. Even with external drop tanks, disposable fuel containers that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat was joined, the Thunderbolt could only escort bombers to a point roughly over the German border before being forced to turn back. Beyond that line, the bombers would be on their own. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, understood this limitation perfectly. They had studied American tactics, analyzed the patterns of bomber formations, and developed counter-tactics specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in the defensive box formation. German fighter pilots were experienced, skilled, and increasingly desperate as the tide of war began to turn against their nation. They knew that every bomber destroyed represented not just a tactical victory, but a small delay in the inevitable Allied advance. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, Germany's primary fighter aircraft, were being modified specifically for bomber interception. Heavier armament, including 20mm and even 30mm cannons, replaced some of the lighter machine guns. Armor plating protected cockpits and critical systems, allowing pilots to close to point-blank range before firing. Some aircraft were configured as Sturmböcke, assault rams, so heavily armoured and armed that they sacrificed speed and manoeuvrability to absorb defensive fire while delivering devastating attacks. The first major raid on Schweinfurt had taken place on August 17, 1943, as part of a dual mission that also targeted aircraft factories at Regensburg. That mission had been costly beyond anything previously experienced by the 8th Air Force. 60 bombers failed to return, and hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors brought back harrowing accounts of relentless fighter attacks, of watching neighbouring aircraft disintegrate under cannon fire, of seeing parachutes blossom in the sky as men abandoned burning fortresses, of emptying ammunition belts while German fighters continued to press their attacks. The damage inflicted on Schweinfurt was significant but not catastrophic. The factories had been hit, production had been disrupted, but German industrial resilience and the dispersal of manufacturing capabilities meant that bearing production recovered more quickly than anticipated. Despite the losses, despite the clear evidence that unescorted bombers were vulnerable, the decision was made to return to Schweinfurt. The reasoning was complex and multifaceted. Intelligence suggested that the earlier raid had inflicted more lasting damage than initially believed. There was pressure from political and military leadership to demonstrate that strategic bombing could achieve decisive results. There was also a genuine belief, perhaps a desperate hope, that the Luftwaffe had been sufficiently weakened by attrition that a second raid might succeed with acceptable losses. Additional tactical modifications had been implemented. More guns had been added to the B-17s, including chin turrets to defend against head-on attacks, which had proven particularly deadly. Crews had received additional training in formation flying and defensive tactics. New drop tank designs promised to extend fighter escort range slightly further. But fundamentally, the mission still required bombers to penetrate deep into Germany without fighter protection for the most dangerous portions of the journey. October 14, 1943, dawned cold and grey across the airfields of eastern England. Crews had been awakened hours before sunrise, roused from their bunks to prepare for the mission they had been briefed on the previous evening. The target was familiar, the risks well understood. Breakfast, such as it was, sat heavily in stomachs knotted with anticipation and fear. Men wrote letters they hoped would never need to be sent, checked and rechecked their equipment, and tried not to think too hard about the statistics, about the odds, about the empty bunks that would greet them if they returned. The pre-flight rituals provided some comfort, familiar routines in a situation that was anything but routine. Pilots conducted their walk-around inspections, checking control surfaces, examining engines for leaks or damage, verifying that ordnance was properly loaded and secured. Gunners test-fired their weapons, the brief chatter of .50 caliber fire echoing across the airfields. Bombardiers carefully checked their bomb sights, those complex optical instruments that would theoretically allow them to place bombs precisely on target from altitudes above 20,000 feet. Navigators reviewed their charts and calculations, plotting courses that would take them to the target and, with luck, back home again. The takeoff sequence was a carefully choreographed ballet of heavy aircraft. 291 B-17s were scheduled for the mission, taking off from multiple airfields and assembling into a stream that would cross the English Channel and penetrate into occupied Europe. The logistics of getting hundreds of heavy bombers airborne, formed into proper defensive formations, and heading in the right direction required precise timing and coordination. Each aircraft carried a crew of 10 men and several tons of fuel and ordnance. The takeoff roll consumed thousands of feet of runway, and fully loaded bombers climbed slowly, gaining altitude gradually as they circled their assembly points. The assembly process itself was complex, with aircraft joining their assigned formations based on coloured flares, radio calls, and visual identification of lead aircraft marked with distinctive patterns. As the bomber stream formed and headed east across the channel, the scene must have been simultaneously magnificent and ominous. Hundreds of aircraft, sunlight glinting off aluminum skin and plexiglass canopies, engines creating a continuous thunder that could be heard for miles, contrails streaming behind at altitude, forming artificial clouds across the sky. Inside each aircraft, 10 men were isolated in their own thoughts, focused on their individual responsibilities, yet bound together by the shared knowledge of what lay ahead. The intercom chatter was professional, terse, limited to necessary communications. Pilots and co-pilots scanned instruments, maintaining position in formation, making constant small adjustments to throttle and control surfaces. Engineers monitored engine performance, watching temperatures and pressures, ready to respond to any malfunction. Bombardiers and navigators worked their calculations, updating positions, adjusting for wind drift. Gunners watched the sky, searching for the first signs of enemy fighters, flexing their hands to keep blood flowing, despite the cold that penetrated even electrically heated flight suits at high altitude. The P-47 Thunderbolts joined the formation over the channel, powerful guardians flanking the bomber stream. Their presence provided tangible reassurance, visible evidence that the bombers would not face the enemy alone, at least not immediately. The fighter pilots flew close formation, conserving fuel, scanning constantly for threats. They knew their role and they knew its limitations. They could protect the bombers for a certain distance, and then physical reality, the immutable laws of fuel consumption and range, would force them to turn back. The escort line, that invisible boundary beyond which the bombers would continue alone, was approaching. It came over Aachen, a German city near the border, already deep inside enemy territory but still far short of the target. The procedure was rehearsed but never routine. Fighter leaders radioed their bomber counterparts, brief acknowledgements of the situation. Wings waggled in salute, a final visual communication. And then the Thunderbolts banked away, turning west toward England and safety, leaving the bomber stream to continue eastward into the gathering storm. The change in atmosphere inside the bombers was immediate and palpable. The loss of the fighter escort was not just a tactical shift, it was a psychological blow. Men who had been tense before now felt their stomachs tighten further. Gunners adjusted their grips on their weapons, testing traverse and elevation one more time. Pilots called for formation tightening, closing the gaps, overlapping fields of fire. The combat box formation, the theoretical invulnerability of massed defensive firepower, now stood alone as the only protection. Every man scanned the sky with renewed intensity, knowing that German radar would have tracked their progress, knowing that Luftwaffe units would be scrambling, climbing to altitude, positioning for attack. The waiting was perhaps the worst part. Minutes stretched endlessly. Every speck on the horizon might be an enemy fighter. Every shadow in the clouds might conceal an attack. Adrenaline heightened senses even as altitude and cold numbed extremities. The German defences were indeed mobilizing. Fighter units across western Germany received their alerts and scrambled. Pilots ran to their aircraft. Ground crews spun propellers or engaged starters. Engines coughed and roared to life. Within minutes, dozens of fighters were lifting off and dozens more followed. The Luftwaffe had developed an extensive early warning system, combining radar, visual observers, and radio communications to track incoming raids and vector fighters to intercept. By the time the American bomber stream crossed the escort line, hundreds of German fighters were already airborne, climbing to altitude, forming into attacking groups. The German pilots were experienced veterans, many with dozens or even hundreds of combat missions. They knew the capabilities and limitations of the B-17, knew where it was vulnerable, knew how to attack for maximum effect. More importantly, they were fighting over their own territory, which meant damaged aircraft could potentially make it back to friendly airfields, downed pilots could be recovered and returned to combat, and fuel constraints were far less limiting than for attacking bombers that had to fight their way to the target and back. The first attacks came without much warning. German fighters, having climbed above the bomber formation, dove from the sun, using altitude and bright sky behind them to mask their approach. The favourite tactic had evolved into head-on attacks, exploiting the relative weakness of the B-17's nose armament despite recent improvements. At a combined closure rate approaching 700 miles per hour, the time window for effective defensive fire was measured in seconds. German pilots, nerves steady despite the terrifying speed of the approach, waited until they were dangerously close before firing. The 20mm and 30mm cannon shells they carried were devastating when they struck. Unlike .50 caliber bullets, which might pass through aluminum skin without catastrophic effect, cannon shells exploded on impact, tearing jagged holes, severing control cables, igniting fuel tanks, killing or wounding crew members with fragments. A single well-placed burst could destroy an engine or blow away a section of wing. Multiple hits could break a bomber apart in mid-air. The American gunners fought back desperately. The moment German fighters were spotted, warning calls crackled over intercoms. Gunners traversed their weapons, following the attackers, pressing triggers, sending streams of .50 caliber fire toward the oncoming fighters. The noise inside the aircraft became overwhelming, the hammering of machine guns combining with the roar of wind through bullet holes and the shouts and screams over the intercom. Empty shell casings clattered across the floor. Cordite smoke filled the interior. The intense cold at altitude combined with the heat of guns fired in long bursts created surreal temperature extremes. Gunners' hands, even in heavy gloves, could freeze to metal or burn on overheated barrels. The physical demands of the fight were exhausting. Rotating heavy turrets, lifting and aiming the weighty .50 caliber weapons, the vibration of sustained fire, all while wearing bulky flight suits and oxygen masks at altitudes where the thin air left men lightheaded despite supplemental oxygen. The casualties began immediately and mounted relentlessly. One moment a fortress would be flying in formation, the next it would stagger as cannon shells walked across its fuselage. Sometimes the damage was survivable, engines feathered, holes patched with whatever was available, aircraft dropping out of formation but still flying. Often it was not. Catastrophic hits to fuel tanks produced instant infernos, flames engulfing the aircraft so quickly that crew members had no chance to bail out. Structural failures, wings tearing away or fuselages breaking apart, were equally fatal. The fortunate, if fortune can be measured in such circumstances, were those who had time to reach their parachutes and jump. Even then, survival was not assured. Parachutes could fail to open. Men could be wounded during the jump or freeze during the long descent. And upon landing, capture by hostile forces, or worse, angry civilians, was a grim possibility. From inside the remaining bombers, the spectacle was nightmarish. Crews watched as aircraft they had been flying formation with seconds earlier simply ceased to exist or fell away in flames. They saw parachutes deploy and counted them, hoping that all 10 crew members from the lost bomber had escaped. They saw parachutes that didn't open, small figures plummeting. They saw German fighters circling around damaged bombers that had fallen behind the formation, harrying them, making repeated passes until the crippled aircraft could no longer stay aloft. Some German pilots showed mercy, allowing clearly doomed aircraft to descend unmolested. Others, driven by the brutal arithmetic of war or personal vengeance for their own losses, continued to fire even at bombers clearly out of the fight. The psychological toll of watching this carnage while simultaneously fighting for your own survival, maintaining formation discipline and continuing toward the target was immense. Men vomited inside their oxygen masks, men wept, men prayed, and men died suddenly and violently, torn apart by explosive shells or crushed in the wreckage of their aircraft. The running battle continued for hours, not minutes. The German tactics evolved dynamically during the engagement. After the initial head-on passes, fighters repositioned for beam attacks, diving from the flanks where defensive fire was less concentrated. Some formations employed what became known as company front attacks, multiple fighters approaching in line abreast, spreading their fire across several bombers simultaneously, making it impossible for defensive gunners to concentrate on any single attacker. Other groups used successive wave attacks, one fighter making a pass, then a second, then a third, keeping up constant pressure, never allowing gunners to relax or reload without threat. The most devastating were the attacks on individual bombers that had been damaged and dropped from formation. German fighters, recognizing a vulnerable target, would swarm it, sometimes 4 or 5 fighters, concentrating on a single crippled fortress, raking it with cannon fire until it fell. This was brutal but tactically sound. A damaged bomber out of formation had limited defensive firepower and was effectively helpless. Finishing it quickly and moving to the next target was simply efficient. By the time the surviving bombers reached Schweinfurt, the formation had been savaged. Dozens of aircraft were gone, many more were damaged, ammunition was running low, and crews were physically and emotionally exhausted. But the mission still demanded completion. The bomb run required aircraft to fly straight and level, maintaining course and altitude despite flak and fighter attacks, while bombardiers made their final calculations and adjustments. This period of vulnerability, when evasive action was impossible, was always the most dangerous part of any mission. German anti-aircraft artillery, the feared flak that created black bursts of explosive fragments at precise altitudes, now joined the fighter attacks. The sky filled with dark puffs, each representing thousands of steel fragments capable of shredding aircraft and crew. The noise of flak fragments hitting the aircraft added to the cacophony of battle. Holes appeared in wings and fuselages, some minor, some catastrophic. More aircraft fell to flak than to fighters during these critical minutes. The bombs finally dropped, tons of high explosive tumbling toward the factories below. From altitude, the results were difficult to assess with precision. Bombardiers reported hits, explosions bloomed, smoke rose. Post-strike reconnaissance photography would later confirm significant damage to the bearing plants and surrounding industrial infrastructure. But in the moment, none of that mattered to the crews. What mattered was completing the turn away from the target and beginning the long journey home, a journey that would offer no respite from attack. The German fighters, far from being exhausted or satisfied, resumed their assault with renewed vigor. They knew the American bombers were now lighter, having dropped their ordnance, but also low on ammunition and fuel, damaged and desperate to escape. The return journey became, if anything, more brutal than the inbound flight. Stragglers, aircraft that could not maintain formation speed due to damaged engines or airframe damage, were picked off methodically. Formations that had been tight at the beginning of the mission were now ragged, gaps evident where dozens of aircraft should have been. The ammunition situation became critical. Gunners who had been firing in controlled bursts now found themselves running completely dry. Some positions exhausted their entire supply of belts, thousands of rounds expended in the desperate effort to keep fighters at bay. Without ammunition, a gun position became simply a place to watch helplessly as German fighters closed without opposition. Some crew members abandoned empty gun positions to help wounded comrades or fight fires. Others stayed at their posts, hoping their presence alone might deter some attacks, a futile gesture in most cases but born of training and discipline. The journey home stretched endlessly. Every minute seemed an hour. Navigation became more challenging as landmarks disappeared beneath clouds or were obscured by battle damage to navigator stations. Radio silence was maintained to prevent German fighters from homing in on transmissions, which meant formations were isolated, each group fighting its own battle, unaware of what was happening to the others. When the coastline of occupied France finally appeared ahead, visible through breaks in the clouds, it offered a glimmer of hope. But even crossing the coast did not end the threat. Some German fighters pursued well out over the water, making final attacks before breaking off to return to their bases. A few bombers, seemingly having survived the entire ordeal, fell into the channel, engines failing, fuel exhausted, or accumulated damage finally overwhelming the aircraft's structural integrity. Those that ditched in the water faced a different kind of fight for survival, waiting in life rafts or floating in frigid water, hoping for rescue before hypothermia or drowning claimed them. The channel, despite its narrowness, was still deadly to downed airmen. Some were picked up by British air-sea rescue launches or passing vessels. Others were not found in time, or were never found at all, becoming statistics recorded as missing in action, their final resting place the cold depths of the sea. The sight of the English coast represented salvation for those who made it that far. But the ordeal was not quite over. Damaged aircraft had to find suitable airfields for emergency landings. Some runways were already crowded with damaged bombers that had landed ahead of them. Aircraft with wounded aboard were given priority, and emergency services, ambulances, and medical personnel stood ready at the edge of runways. Many bombers landed with systems barely functioning, hydraulics shot out requiring manual gear extension, brakes damaged or destroyed, control surfaces shredded or partially missing. Some pilots brought their aircraft in on 2 engines, or even 1, feathered propellers windmilling uselessly. Others made belly landings, gear up, skidding across grass or concrete in showers of sparks and tearing metal. The skill demonstrated by pilots in bringing home aircraft that by all rights should not have been flyable was extraordinary, testament to their training and determination. As aircraft finally came to rest on English soil, the true scope of the disaster became apparent. Ground crews and support personnel who rushed to meet the returning bombers found scenes of carnage. Blood pooled on floors and spattered on bulkheads. Wounded and dead crew members had to be carefully extracted from cramped positions. The damage to the aircraft themselves was staggering. Holes punched through wings and fuselages, entire sections of skin torn away, control surfaces shredded, engines destroyed, interiors gutted by fire. That any of these aircraft had made it home seemed miraculous, but the count of returning aircraft was what drove home the magnitude of the loss. As hours passed and it became clear no more bombers would be arriving, the final tally was grimmer than even the most pessimistic predictions. 60 aircraft had failed to return, roughly 20% of the attacking force. More than 600 men were missing, killed, or captured. Of the aircraft that did return, only a handful were undamaged. The majority bore significant battle damage, ranging from repairable to beyond salvage. The human cost extended far beyond the numbers. Entire crews had been wiped out, men who had trained together, flown together, and died together. The empty bunks and personal effects of the missing created a haunting presence in barracks and tents. Letters from home arrived addressed to men who would never read them. Belongings had to be carefully packed and shipped back to families who would receive them, along with official notifications of loss. The survivors, those who had made it back, carried their own burdens. They had seen friends die, sometimes right beside them. They had experienced hours of terror and violence. Many were wounded, some seriously. Even those who were physically unharmed bore psychological scars. The 1,000-yard stare, the tremor in hands, the inability to sleep, or the nightmares when sleep finally came, these were the invisible wounds that would haunt men for the rest of their lives. Conversations about the mission were subdued, fragmentary, as men tried to process what they had experienced. Some sought solace in alcohol, others in silence, still others in writing detailed accounts of what they had witnessed, as if committing the horror to paper might somehow exorcise it from memory. The immediate aftermath brought official responses at various levels. Mission reports were compiled from debriefings, attempting to piece together a coherent picture of what had happened from dozens of individual perspectives. The damage to Schweinfurt was assessed through reconnaissance photography and intelligence reports. Claims of German fighters destroyed were tallied, though these were notoriously unreliable in the confusion of combat, with multiple gunners often claiming credit for the same kill. Medical facilities treated the wounded, some of whom would recover fully, others who would bear permanent disabilities. The decision-makers, the generals and planners who had authorized the mission, were forced to confront its results. The raid had inflicted damage on the target, but at a cost that was clearly unsustainable. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber had been tested to destruction and found fatally flawed. Without adequate fighter escort, deep penetration raids into Germany would result in losses that would soon destroy the 8th Air Force as an effective fighting force. The strategic implications were profound and immediate. Orders went out suspending deep penetration missions until long-range fighter escort became available. This represented a fundamental admission that the pre-war doctrine had been wrong, that courage and defensive armament alone could not overcome a determined and skilled enemy fighting over home territory. The delay frustrated those who wanted to maintain pressure on German industry, but continuing to send bombers into Germany under existing conditions would have been murderous rather than strategic. The focus shifted urgently to accelerating the deployment of the P-51 Mustang and extending its range. The Mustang, which had shown promise in earlier operations, now became a critical priority. Engineering teams worked to optimize its range with larger internal fuel tanks and improved drop tank designs. Production was accelerated. Training of Mustang pilots intensified. The entire apparatus of American industrial might and organizational capability focused on solving the problem that Schweinfurt had made impossible to ignore. The longer-term impact on air strategy was equally significant. The concept of fighter escort evolved from mere protection to active offense. Rather than simply guarding the bombers, fighters would sweep ahead, seeking out and destroying German fighters before they could form up for attacks on the bomber stream. The fighters would also strafe German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and attacking the infrastructure that supported Luftwaffe operations. This more aggressive employment of fighters gradually shifted the balance of power in the air war. As Mustang numbers increased through late 1943 and into 1944, German fighter losses mounted. The Luftwaffe, which had been ascendant during the Schweinfurt missions, found itself increasingly on the defensive. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages limited training for new pilots, creating a vicious cycle where inexperienced pilots were thrown into combat and quickly lost. By mid-1944, the air superiority that had cost so much blood to establish belonged decisively to the Allies. The legacy of Black Thursday, as October 14, 1943 came to be known, extended beyond tactical and strategic adjustments. It became a reference point, a cautionary tale about the dangers of doctrinal rigidity and the importance of adapting to battlefield realities. The courage of the crews who flew the mission was never in question, but courage alone had proven insufficient. The mission validated the importance of combined arms warfare, the integration of different capabilities, bombers and fighters working together, each compensating for the other's weaknesses. It also demonstrated the resilience of industrial systems. Despite the damage inflicted on Schweinfurt, German ball-bearing production recovered relatively quickly through dispersal and substitution. This suggested that even successful attacks on industrial targets might not produce the decisive effects that had been predicted, a lesson that would influence thinking about strategic bombing for decades to come. For Germany, Schweinfurt represented both a defensive victory and a warning. The Luftwaffe had proven it could inflict unsustainable losses on unescorted bomber formations, validating its tactics and equipment. But the cost to the Luftwaffe itself had not been negligible. Dozens of fighters had been shot down, experienced pilots killed or wounded. Ammunition and fuel had been expended in large quantities. The industrial targets, while not completely destroyed, had been damaged, requiring resources to repair that could have been used elsewhere. Most ominously for Germany, the raid demonstrated that the Allies were willing to accept heavy losses in pursuit of strategic objectives, and that they had the industrial capacity to replace lost aircraft and train new crews. The arithmetic of attrition, if it continued at these rates, would eventually favour the side with greater resources, and that side was unquestionably the Allies. The personal stories emerging from Schweinfurt were countless, each one a small tragedy or triumph within the larger catastrophe. There were tales of heroism, pilots holding formation despite impossible damage, gunners fighting until they collapsed from wounds or exhaustion, bombardiers completing their runs despite fighters and flak. There were stories of survival against odds, men parachuting from exploding aircraft, evading capture, making their way through occupied territory to Spain or Switzerland and eventually back to England. There were stories of loss, of last radio transmissions from doomed aircraft, of men seen falling without parachutes, of entire crews lost without survivors to tell what had happened to them. Medical personnel who treated the wounded marveled at injuries survived and mourned those who died despite their best efforts. Chaplains who wrote to families struggled to find words that might offer comfort in the face of such loss. The aircraft themselves became characters in these stories. Individual B-17s that had survived multiple missions gained reputations and names, decorated with nose art and mission markers. Crews developed superstitious attachments to particular aircraft, believing some were lucky and others cursed. The bombers that limped back to England bearing testimony to the violence of combat, riddled with holes but still flying, represented triumph over adversity. Those that never returned became memorials, their names recorded in squadron histories, their fates investigated as far as possible from the fragmented evidence of witness accounts and enemy records. Every missing aircraft represented 10 families receiving devastating news, 10 sets of personal effects being packed and shipped, 10 empty places at mess tables and in barracks. The mechanics and ground crews who maintained the bombers faced their own challenges in the wake of Schweinfurt. The sheer volume of battle damage overwhelmed normal repair capacities. Aircraft that would normally be written off as beyond economical repair were instead patched and returned to service because replacement aircraft were not available quickly enough. Mechanics worked exhausting shifts, cannibalizing parts from the most badly damaged aircraft to repair those that could be salvaged. The ingenuity displayed in these repair efforts was remarkable, improvising solutions with available materials, fabricating replacement parts in field workshops, finding ways to restore structural integrity to airframes that looked like scrap metal. The ground crews developed a personal investment in getting aircraft back into service, knowing that these machines carried men they knew, friends and colleagues, into combat. Every bomber returned to flight status represented lives potentially saved on future missions. The intelligence analysts who assessed the mission results faced a complex task. Bomb damage assessment from reconnaissance photographs provided some objective data about destruction in the target area, but translating that into meaningful estimates of impact on German war production required sophisticated analysis. The claims of enemy fighters destroyed had to be evaluated skeptically, knowing that overclaiming was inevitable in the confusion of battle. The lessons about German tactics and capabilities needed to be extracted and disseminated to improve future operations. Reports on the effectiveness of defensive formations, ammunition expenditure rates, vulnerable positions on the aircraft, all of this had to be compiled, analyzed, and turned into actionable recommendations. The intelligence picture of German air defenses was constantly evolving, requiring continuous updating as new tactics and equipment appeared. The broader Allied command structure had to grapple with the implications of Schweinfurt for the entire strategic bombing campaign. The Americans and British already had somewhat different philosophies, with the RAF conducting area raids at night, while the Americans pursued precision daylight bombing. Schweinfurt raised questions about whether the American approach was viable without prohibitive losses. There were advocates for shifting to night operations entirely, while others argued that the solution was better escort and persistence rather than abandonment of daylight operations. The political dimension added another layer of complexity. Strategic bombing was consuming enormous resources and manpower. Justifying this investment required demonstrable results, and a single mission that cost 60 bombers and achieved only temporary disruption of one industrial target was difficult to portray as success. The pressure to show progress while simultaneously protecting crews from unsustainable losses created inherent tension in planning and execution of subsequent operations. The psychological impact on crew morale was significant and concerning to commanders. Men who had survived Schweinfurt knew they would be expected to fly more missions. The standard tour of duty for bomber crews required 25 missions, later increased to 30 and eventually 35 as the war progressed. After experiencing Black Thursday, the prospect of flying dozens more missions into German airspace was daunting. Some men reached their breaking point, unable to face returning to combat. The phenomenon of combat fatigue, what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress, was poorly understood at the time, often stigmatized as cowardice or lack of moral fiber. Men who broke down were sometimes treated sympathetically, sent to rest facilities or reassigned to non-combat duties, but others faced harsh judgment and disciplinary action. The line between legitimate psychological trauma and failure of nerve was imprecisely drawn, and commanders struggled to balance maintaining discipline with recognizing genuine medical conditions. For the crews still operational, there was a complex mix of emotions. Pride in having completed the mission and survived existed alongside grief for lost friends and apprehension about future missions. The bonds between crew members intensified, men who had faced death together developing relationships deeper than normal friendships. They looked out for each other, shared resources, covered for each other's weaknesses. The crew of a bomber became a small family, isolated together in their aircraft for hours during each mission, dependent on each other for survival. When a crew was broken up by casualties, the survivors often struggled to integrate into new crews, the chemistry and trust having to be rebuilt from scratch. Some men refused to fly with unfamiliar crew members, requesting and sometimes receiving permission to remain grounded until their own crew was reconstituted. The evolution of equipment and tactics following Schweinfurt was rapid and comprehensive. New defensive positions and armament configurations were tested and implemented. The chin turret, added to counter head-on attacks, became standard. Experiments with different ammunition types sought to maximize effectiveness against German fighters. Armor protection for crew positions was increased where possible, though always balanced against the weight penalty that reduced bomb load and range. Formation tactics were refined, seeking optimal balance between defensive firepower and bombing accuracy. Lead crews received additional training in pathfinding and precision navigation. The entire system of air operations became more sophisticated and professional as lessons were absorbed and applied. The German response to the threat of resumed strategic bombing also evolved. Recognizing that the Americans would eventually solve the escort problem, the Luftwaffe attempted to build up fighter strength and improve performance. New aircraft types, including jets that would appear later in the war, were developed in a race against time and resources. The dispersion of industry, which had begun as a response to bombing, accelerated. Critical manufacturing was moved into smaller facilities, underground factories, and geographically distributed locations that were harder to target effectively. This improved resilience, but also introduced inefficiencies and coordination challenges that reduced overall output. The German homeland air defense system became increasingly elaborate, with radar networks, control centers, and fighter allocation procedures designed to concentrate forces against incoming raids. Historical analysis of Schweinfurt has generated extensive debate among military historians and strategists. Some argue that the mission was a necessary, if costly, step in developing effective strategic bombing capability, that the lessons learned justified the price paid. Others contend that the mission was a predictable disaster that should never have been authorized given known limitations in escort range. The assessment of whether the damage to German ball-bearing production justified the losses depends on assumptions about alternative uses of resources and counterfactual scenarios about what might have happened differently. What is not debatable is that Schweinfurt represented a watershed moment, forcing fundamental changes in how the air war was conducted and accelerating developments that would ultimately establish Allied air superiority over Europe. The human dimension of Schweinfurt remained the most powerful aspect of its legacy. Reunions of survivors, held decades after the war, brought together men who had shared the experience of Black Thursday. Their accounts, recorded in memoirs and oral histories, preserved details that official records could never capture: the fear and courage, the chaos and clarity, the randomness of survival and the finality of loss. Museums and memorials displayed relics of the raid, pieces of aircraft, personal effects, photographs of young men in uniform who would never grow old. Educational efforts used Schweinfurt as a case study in military history courses, analysing the tactical, operational and strategic dimensions of the mission. Veterans who spoke to students and audiences tried to convey what it had been like, though they often acknowledged that words could never fully communicate the reality of combat. The families of those who did not return from Schweinfurt carried their own burdens. Gold Star mothers and widows lived with loss that time might soften but never erase. Children who grew up without fathers had to come to terms with abstract concepts of duty and sacrifice. The question of whether the mission was worth the cost had very personal dimensions for those who paid the price directly. Most accepted that their loved ones had died in a necessary cause, fighting against genuine evil, contributing to ultimate victory. But acceptance of necessity did not eliminate grief, and the pain of loss remained real regardless of historical context. The notifications of death or missing status arrived in telegrams, stark and impersonal, beginning the process of official condolence and support that could never truly compensate for what had been taken. The broader cultural impact of Schweinfurt and missions like it shaped how Americans understood the air war and military service. The image of bomber crews, young men volunteering to fly into lethal skies day after day, became part of the national narrative about the greatest generation. Books, films, and later television productions drew on these stories, sometimes accurately, sometimes with dramatic license, but consistently portraying the bomber crews as heroic figures. This cultural representation influenced post-war attitudes toward military service and sacrifice, creating expectations and templates that would affect subsequent conflicts. The reality, as always, was more complex and nuanced than popular portrayals, but the fundamental truth of courage in the face of terrible danger was never in question. For the Allied strategic bombing campaign as a whole, Schweinfurt was both a nadir and a turning point. The losses could not be sustained, but they forced the changes necessary to make the campaign viable. The arrival of long-range escort fighters in significant numbers, beginning in early 1944 and rapidly expanding thereafter, transformed the operational environment. The Mustangs, flying with the bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back, engaged German fighters on more equal terms and gradually established dominance. The toll on the Luftwaffe became unsustainable, and by the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, Allied air superiority was so complete that German aircraft were largely absent from the battlefield. This air superiority was purchased in part with the bloodshed over Schweinfurt and similar missions, where the inadequacy of existing approaches had been demonstrated and the need for change made undeniable. The technical evolution continued throughout the remainder of the war. The B-17 itself went through multiple iterations, each incorporating lessons from combat. Later models had improved defensive armament, better crew protection, upgraded systems, and refinements based on operational experience. The P-51 Mustang similarly evolved, with engine upgrades, additional fuel capacity, and improved armament. Other aircraft types entered service, including the B-24 Liberator, which eventually surpassed the B-17 in numbers produced, though never quite capturing the same iconic status. The coordination between bombers and fighters became increasingly sophisticated, with fighter sweeps timed to engage German fighters before they could form up, close escort staying with bomber formations, and target area support attacking ground defences. The entire apparatus of strategic bombing matured from the relatively crude early efforts into a complex, integrated system capable of placing thousands of aircraft over targets with reasonable accuracy and acceptable losses. The end of the war brought its own reckoning with the strategic bombing campaign and missions like Schweinfurt. Post-war studies, including the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, attempted to assess objectively what had been achieved and at what cost. The findings were complex and sometimes contradictory. Strategic bombing had clearly contributed to Allied victory, but its effectiveness varied considerably by target type and period. Transportation networks and oil production proved more vulnerable to systematic attack than individual industrial plants. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was less decisive than pre-war theorists had predicted. The resources devoted to air defense, both active fighters and flak and passive dispersal and hardening, represented a significant drain on German war efforts, though quantifying this effect precisely remained challenging. The human cost of the bombing campaign, both in aircrew casualties and in civilian deaths on the ground, raised moral and ethical questions that continue to be debated. For those who had been there, who had flown through the nightmare of Black Thursday, the academic analyses and historical assessments were abstract compared to lived experience. They knew what they had seen and felt and endured. They knew the friends they had lost, the terror they had faced, the relief of survival. As veterans aged and the passage of time provided perspective, many reflected on the meaning of their service and sacrifice. Most expressed pride in having contributed to defeating fascism and defending freedom. Many acknowledged the horror of what they had experienced and the permanent impact it had on their lives. Few claimed to fully understand the larger strategic and historical forces in which they had been caught up, recognizing that individual experience provides only a limited view of vast events. But their testimony, preserved in countless interviews, memoirs, and documentary records, ensures that Schweinfurt and Black Thursday will be remembered not just as statistics and tactical analyses, but as human stories of courage, loss, and survival in one of history's great conflicts.